The topic for today's episode is single, retired, and vulnerable. And my guest is fellow retirement coach and author Doug Passanisi. And Doug resides in New York City. Doug and I both wrote a chapter in the book, The Retirement Challenge, a non-financial guide from top retirement experts. And Doug's chapter was titled Single, Retired, and Vulnerable. So I'm very happy to have Doug here to talk about his chapter and share his experience. So welcome, Doug. Thanks for being here and sharing your chapter with us.
Great to be here, and thanks for having me, Reed.
Absolutely. So let's just jump in. I think the best way to set the stage for your chapter, Doug, is to just give us a little bit of your background and maybe your work experience and what kind of led up to it from your career history standpoint. What led up to the point of you ending up being retired and vulnerable and single, all kind of at the same time?
Yeah, I had a career in the International Civil Service and hadn't really much paid attention to a plan for retirement. All I wanted to do was get my retirement. So I concentrated sort of wholeheartedly on my job, which I loved for years and years. It entailed a lot of travel, lots of responsibility, a lot of staffing, finance, etc. So being entirely involved, and I wouldn't say a workaholic, but close to a workaholic-ish. When one of the organization's restructuring exercises happened, I was actually helping them do that for my unit. So I did that actually without losing one person, restructuring, retraining, the whole thing. And 2 weeks later, I was notified that my position, there was a whole line of management positions that were being eliminated. And I was 60 and a half, and we have forced retirement at 62. So basically, my HR department said, you know what, get out. So I didn't have much of a choice there. I could have tried to hang around for a year and a half and puzzle things together, but I didn't really feel like doing that. So I ended up, I was single. I've grown kids, but they're moved out. But then without a partner, without my work, and without a plan, because this all happened really, literally within weeks.
Wow.
There, I found myself sitting at home watching Judge Judy, sort of scratching my head, going, how did I end up here?
Yeah, and I think that's becoming more of a common story too. I have two people that I know from different kind of social circles, but that happened to them too, where very close to retirement, reorganizations happened, and they were just cut out of the picture just very, very quickly.
Well, unfortunately, while we have the most experience, we're also the most expensive.
Yep.
And, they would rather hire two 22-year-olds than one 60-year-old in many cases, not all cases. But that's pretty hard to take when that's a big part of your life.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So that's how I ended up, and frankly, that title was really how I felt when I was sitting at home with no office to go to. Was here I am, don't have a partner, don't have a job, and gee, I'm pretty vulnerable to the entire world here. So what do I do?
Nobody to share the experience with, really, at that point. So that kind of leads me into my first question. What were some of your initial thoughts, feelings, and emotions that you encountered during this transition? What kind of initially hit you?
I would have to say that, well, initially losing my job, I was angry, especially because there's sort of that spousal thing with your job. If in fact you like your job and you've been at your job for a while and dedicated to it, where you're angry that your other half is leaving. Right. So all of the investment, and you're sitting there on your own. So I would say the first would be anger. And frankly, it took me a long time to get this, but I think A second was grief. I mean, I really was grieving the loss of being at my job. And I didn't really know sort of where that came from until I had to sort of sit there and separate my feelings. But it really was a sense of loss. Then I'd say from there, then I got excited. It was sort of the, well, you know, okay, I'll get up, you know, pull myself up on my socks and go get a new job, and this will be exciting. And so there was that sort of a little bit of excitement period. And that finally sort of led to a sort of disillusionment whereby you find out that not that many people want to hire a 60-year-old with a particular kind of experience that may or may not be specifically applicable, especially in the millennial world where we're living with technology and so on, that you may not be quite up to speed on. So I found myself overpriced, overexperienced, and that excitement faded rather quickly.
And I think what's interesting about what you just said, Doug, was there's a period where it's kind of an ebb and a flow, right? It goes from kind of being a low point to then having this excitement about the possibilities. So you kind of get up a little bit higher, and then you realize, well, being that age, I'm not going to find exactly what I had before. So then you kind of drop down into another low. And so it seems like you're kind of waffling between these highs and lows, which makes it hard.
And you find out that we don't really know at your age of retirement at 60 what it's like, what it actually means to apply for a job now, because it's not what it was when we applied for jobs.
Right.
And all through my career anyway, I went from job to job, even in the same organization, with ease. You network, you find something else, find something else. I mean, it's just life that happens around you. But suddenly I found that wasn't quite, there wasn't as much movement, let me say, as there had been in the past. And I was actually shocked at that because the career people I went to said, oh, you've got this excellent CV, your resume is fantastic, you're going to have absolutely no problem finding a job. Well, I mean, they were completely wrong. So there was a bit of a wake-up call.
So one of the other things that you talk about in your chapter was it was difficult for others to understand. So others meaning your friends, your family, your former colleagues. It was difficult for them to understand and sympathize with your situation. So tell us why it was difficult for them to understand it, first of all, but also to sympathize. And then how did you work through that?
That was pretty interesting because all the different types of things you experience, typically you go to friends, or it doesn't matter what the issue is, they understand it because they've been through it. Relationship problem, family issue, work concern, all those, we've all been through those things. But retirement is a specific animal. And because most of my colleagues at work were younger than I was, I actually had very few friends who had retired. In fact, I had just a handful. So there was a very small pool to draw from. And when talking about this with the younger folks who were my colleagues at work, they were like, well, what's the problem? Great, go get another job. Yeah, there's fun. There's great things over here and here and here. Of course, they were all 40. So, so that didn't help me much. And the folks who I knew who had retired, those few were very happy to retire. They had planned it. They worked on it for a long time. And when they left their job, they were happy to leave their job. And when I left my job, I didn't want to leave my job. So there was a big disconnect there because their impression was, we work not to work. So now you don't have to work. So what are you complaining about? And right. They didn't understand that whole sense of grieving and loss that I was feeling. And the younger folks had no idea what I was talking about. So there was a bit of a gap in where to turn.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting what you talked about too, is the people that planned for their retirement and knew what that point of their life was going to look like were the ones from your experience that were successful. But if it happens to you unexpectedly, a lot of people are unprepared for that. So I think that's another reason for people to, even if they aren't necessarily looking to make a change, is to do a little bit of planning, because then at least if something like that does happen unexpectedly, at least you're a little prepared for it.
That's right, and that plan has a lot of pieces. And
Yep.
For the folks who had thought about it, I just wasn't one of those people who, you know, I didn't realize, I mean, I know this sounds silly, but, you know, I didn't realize I was 60. And I didn't realize that I was going to retire. And I didn't realize that I had to decide what that meant, because that was something that my parents did.
Right.
So I just did not, I was totally unaware that I was in that category, that I would have to start thinking and planning for that. And as silly as that sounds, I think part of that comes from being single, because when you're single, you're still sort of out and about, and you're not maybe quite as structured as a couple with a family might be, where you've had to plan for paying for universities and doing things. When you end up single on your own, you keep going without that structure a bit. So it may come more of a surprise.
Yep. Yep. In another part of your chapter, Doug, you talk about finding a peer group of similarly experienced and retired individuals to help you during your transition. How did you go about finding or identifying a group of other individuals in a similar situation, and how did they help you?
I actually had to reach out to find first colleagues who I knew retired, or colleagues who knew of other colleagues who had retired, so I could chat with them about what they did and what plans they had, and so what they were doing now, and was their life fulfilling, and, you know, all those basic questions. But I really needed a peer group. I ended up actually having a coach, and it meant so much to me having that support, that the need for that support, and asking for that support in order to find sort of where exactly I wanted to be. That was, in fact, that's why I'm a retirement coach, because that support was so absolutely essential for me to move on, that I wanted to be that for others as well. And so I went and got certified as a coach, in fact, because of that.
So when you reached out, you probably didn't even know at that time that there was somebody that was called a retirement coach, or were you introduced to that person, or did you?
I knew that person who was a life coach, but had dealt with people who were retiring. And
okay,
after I got through that, I investigated retirement and started reading about retirement, and actually discovered that there is a field of retirement coaching, and I jumped right in.
Okay, good. So what are some of the things that you learned as a result of going through this transition? Maybe things that you can share with others, kind of more broad-based things.
You know, I do a lot of training. I do a lot of facilitation of groups and teams and leaders, and I use a lot of TED Talks and other inspirational sorts of materials in the work that I do with those teams. And the application of those is meant for teams or for those professionals in a work situation. And I happen to use a lot of Simon Sinek, which I don't know if you're familiar with, a lot of folks use.
Yep.
But what I found was that what he applies to leaders and organizations, there was a big void in me as an individual. And his way of looking at, for example, an organization, if you're working on a team, if you don't have a common purpose, a common why you're doing what you do, you're never going to work as a team towards a common end, because you're doing it for different purposes. So that whole why am I here? What do I want? What is my purpose? What do I value? and then what am I going to do given that value, and then how do I want to do that? That whole why, what, and how model that he uses, I found was actually very applicable to me. That I needed to ask those same 3 questions. And it's very interesting that in the example he gives about the importance of having a vision and having something, a purpose and a value, is when he says, Martin Luther King didn't get hundreds of thousands of people in Washington by saying, I have a plan. It was his dream that caught on, and his dream that intrigued, and his dream that went. And it is absolutely true. And with the organizations and the groups I work with, they find that so useful to bond together by that purpose and value. And when I retired, I found that I personally didn't have that. And so it was very useful to sit down with myself to use that same model.
Yep, perfect. So were there any things, Doug, that you discovered about yourself personally as you went through this process? Maybe things that you weren't aware of yourself, that you found that you either had more strength than you thought you had, or you had more resilience, or is there anything that you kind of found out about yourself?
Well, strength and resilience, maybe worked in there, but I will tell you very specific things that I found out. And one is I didn't know what leisure time meant. And I know that sounds really silly, but I had hobbies and I did things and all that, but I never actually thought about what does leisure mean and leisure time, and having that leisurely life. What is that? And how do I do it? So that was one thing that was quite surprising. The other thing was I didn't really know how to manage time outside of work very well. And that is that, in work, I was very self-directed. That's what I did. That was what my job was. Outside of work, I was pretty lackadaisical. Like, I do that at work. I don't want to do that now. So if we're going to dinner, don't ask me if I want Chinese or Italian. Just decide, because I've been making decisions all day at work. So you end up being less directive than you are at work. And yet yourself is where all that energy should be put. And I found that, in fact, I had taken that, or it was robbed, or I gave it away, but it sat at work. It didn't sit within myself. And I had to regain that.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, Doug, is that a lot of people, when they retire, all of a sudden now you have an entire day to do whatever you want. And the leisure activities will make up whatever portion you decide they'll make up of your day. But a lot of people aren't used to planning for those or incorporating those into their day. So I think that's really important for people to think about, is what, not only what leisure activities you're going to do, but how much time they take each day.
Right.
And work that into your schedule.
Well, it's interesting because the people, I had a client and I asked her how she envisaged her retirement. She goes, well, I want to cook. And I said, okay, do you mean you want to open a restaurant, or you're going to sell cakes, or what does that mean? Oh no, I just want to cook more. And I said, well, you realize you may have another 30 years. So are you going to cook for those 30? I mean, what does that mean, cook? And what part of that is your leisure time that you want to spend, which is a great thing. And then how about the other 23 hours a day?
Right.
So yeah, it is an important aspect to look at.
In your book chapter, you have a section that's titled Embracing Vulnerability and Seeking Support. What advice would you offer others from your experience embracing vulnerability and seeking support? And we talked a little bit, I think, earlier about the support that you seeked, but maybe tell us a little bit more about kind of those two areas.
I actually learned a lot from a close friend of mine who was in recovery. And we had so many conversations about what he was going through, leaving his substance behind, and what I was going through, leaving my work behind. And they ran in parallel. It was really quite amazing. We both faced similar vulnerabilities, similar, he got a sponsor, I got a coach. He went to AA, I had a peer group of retirees. He took steps to make a plan, I made steps to take a plan. I mean, it was really looking at all the vulnerabilities that happen to you that you're afraid of, but actually you just have to say, you know what, this is going to happen, and I may fall down, but I'm going to have to get back up, and here's my support around me, be it family or friends or coach or therapist or whatever it is, in order to help me get along and get what I want to get out of retirement. And he found the same thing out of recovery. So I would just say that was not being afraid of that and not stepping away from it. I'm a big believer in Brené Brown's whole philosophy about vulnerability, and I would say that embracing that and knowing that that's okay is probably one of the greatest things to realize and to appreciate about yourself.
Yeah, I think that's good advice, Doug. There's so many things that happen in that retirement transition, and you kind of just have to roll with it, right? You make the best out of it. You do what you can, and I think by embracing that vulnerability, that makes the transition much more doable.
Well, and it's only from the fall that you stand up. I mean, you know that's where the good things come, or it may not be in the moment, but because of the moment, you learn something new, you meet someone new, whatever, and that's where that change happens. And that's where that's the transition.
Yeah.
That's the retirement transition. Is meeting those things and going, well, maybe we can do this or that or the other. And it's pretty exciting, but it's difficult at first to take that on.
Right. You had a great line in the chapter, Doug, and I wanted you to talk a little bit about that. And what you say is the journey through life is iterative. So tell us what you mean by that and why it's important for people to keep that in mind as they transition into retirement.
Yeah, life is iterative. I actually want to give you an example of that, and that's that. I was talking with a friend of mine, and he was going through some difficulties, both sort of job and marriage, and something just a normal sort of thing, but it seemed to be piling up a bit. And I asked him, I said, well, after they had just moved to a new place, didn't know people in their neighborhoods, it was sort of a combination of things. And I said, so tell me what you feel. How are you feeling about your life? And he said, I feel like my Play-Doh is gray. And for those of us who were raised with Play-Doh, you know that, you have these canisters, they're really fun and creative. But the more you play with them and you're not paying attention, the more they get mushed together. And at the end of the day, you end up with this clump of gray goo in front of you that is absolutely horrible to look at. You don't want to play with it anymore and you throw it away. And I just thought that this was such a great metaphor because, in fact, he actually said, what I need to do is buy new canisters of Play-Doh and intentionally look at each color and name it and create something in that color and decide how it fits together, how those different canisters and colors fit together rather than just clumping them together in a big, ugly gray ball. And I think that's really, that sense of being iterative is, things happen and you learn and you move and you make the wrong move and you go, you know what? We put it together, we take it apart, we take it apart separately, or it may end up together again, but the whole thing is to keep learning as you go through that and appreciate the fact that you're lucky enough to have the opportunity to buy some more canisters and start again.
Right. And I think the other thing to add to that too is to keep a positive attitude. Just like we talked about before, know that some of these challenges are going to be in front of us, but keep a positive attitude, keep, like you said, learning and growing, and make it as enjoyable as you can.
Yeah.
So lastly, before we wrap up here, Doug, is there anything else that you'd like to share about the chapter? I know we didn't have time to cover your entire chapter. There's a lot of great points that you make, a lot of great advice in the chapter. I encourage people to go purchase the book. I will include a link to the book in the transcript for this episode again, so people can go read Doug's entire chapter. But before we close, Doug, is there anything you want to add?
Actually, there's one thing I think I'd add, and that is linked to what we just spoke about, and that is the iterative nature of life and therefore retirement. And that is that, you know, maintaining a sustainable curiosity throughout retirement is so important, because once you become complacent with that, you know, you start sitting down and watching I Love Lucy. I mean, you really, that sustainable curiosity, and it doesn't matter about what, because, you know, the older we get, things happen, and all the different dimensions that we coach in, for example, health and relationships and time management, building legacies, all these things, they're all very curious. And you can actually get so involved in looking at health issues and what they mean and finding out about them. And not only for yourself, but for your family members or your friends, or you end up being a health proxy for your neighbor next door, or you know, all these things they're really great if you maintain a level of sustainable curiosity, so you're always learning. And if you do that, you will be vibrant and young, you know, as you continue through your aging, even though, you know, the arthritis might kick in, but, you know, your mind is still going and curious, and that's the great thing that we have. You know, Reed, as we've talked about before, you know, the thing now about retirement that may not have been the same in our parents' time, or certainly in our grandparents' time, and that is, you know, I may spend more time retired from my profession than I actually had in my profession.
Yeah.
So if you're taking that I may have another 30 years to live, which is longer than I spent at that particular career that I mentioned, that's a long time. And if I don't have the curiosity to find out about what's around me, what I want to do in the world, and my place in it, and what I value in it, it's really a big loss. So I would say,
yeah, that's a great point and a great place to end on. And I think that's perfect advice. Stay curious. And one thing that I hadn't thought of, Doug, is what you pointed out, is stay curious in all these different areas and aspects of retirement, whether it's our health, whether it's our friends, all of the different aspects. If you stay curious, that will keep, I think, all of us moving forward and moving forward successfully in retirement.
Yeah, keeping engaged in your life, no matter what aspect. That's right.
Yep. That's great, Doug. Again, I appreciate you sharing your chapter with us today, and hopefully we'll talk again soon. Thanks, Doug.
Very good. Great to see you. Thanks, Reed.
Yep.